So, support for the separation of Western Australia, or Westralia as some folks call it, grew again during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. During the pandemic, there was this policy of strict closure of Australia's borders from the rest of Australia by the Premier of Western Australia. This border, reminded many people of the long-standing separation of Western Australia throughout history and really put it at odds with its neighbours in the east. An opinion poll in October 2020 by Acting Research found that 28% of Western Australians support leaving the Australian Federation. That means 1 in 4 people living in Western Australia say they want the state to separate from Australia. Although only a quarter of Western Australians want independence, it does show that the separatist movement is still alive and still fighting to separate from Australia. So why does Western Australia want to separate from Australia? If the state does form its own nation, wouldn't this condition reduce the impact of Australia's threat to Indonesia? Western Australia's long distance from its sister states makes it a late-growing and developing member of the Australian Commonwealth. The sense of separation is still felt today, even though formal separation, which was once the dream of Western Australians, is still just a fantasy. Early in the Australian Union, up until the 1880s, Western Australia's economy was based on wheat, meat and wool. A major change in the colony's fortunes happened when gold was discovered, and tens of thousands of miners rushed across the country in an attempt to find new goldfields. In the 1890s, the campaign to unite the Australian colonies gained momentum. Depression in the eastern colonies strengthened the argument that all Australians would benefit from a common market. At this time, Western Australians were far from convinced. The discovery of gold had led to rapid growth in Western Australia's population and wealth, but locals feared that their prosperity would be undermined by greater competition with the eastern states. Western Australia was the last British colony in Australia to agree to join the new federation in 1901. The idea of independence was not a new idea in Western Australia. In 1933, the local parliament even held a referendum on secession, and it was supported by a majority of the population. The results of the referendum showed that 66.23% of voters supported Western Australia's separation from the Australian federal government. However, Western Australia's desire to separate from the Commonwealth of Australia was eventually overruled by the British Parliament as the parent of the Commonwealth. The desire for independence has coloured Western Australia's history because of its rich natural resources, covering about 1/3 of the country's land area. The territory has a variety of minerals, meaning that the majority of Australia's gross domestic product derived from mining exports is almost certainly the result of exploitation of the western part of the country. But locals feel that the allocation of development funds from the centre for the Western Australian region is just too minimal. The capital of Western Australia, Perth, is visibly not as developed as Sydney, Melbourne or Adelaide. Policymakers in Canberra, the Australian capital, are often accused by supporters of separatism of being biased towards developing only the eastern part of the country. In the early 21st century, Australia was in the midst of a resource boom that once again meant that Western Australia's economic contribution to the Australian economy was at a high point. Perceptions of the low share of development funds from the centre compared to its economic contribution sparked a further wave of secessionist rhetoric. On the 22nd of October 2008, former Western Australian Premier Richard Cord said that, support for the separatist movement was growing as the Commonwealth government continued to exploit the state's resource-rich economy and failed to share prosperity equally. At that time, Western Australia contributed about 35% of the country's export earnings. However, much of its revenue was being used to strengthen Canberra's growing financial power. The state has a population of around 10% of the national population, generating more than 10% of the goods and services tax revenue, but only receives 6% of what is distributed. In July 2011, Western Australia's Minister for Mines and Petroleum Norman Moore made a controversial statement that Western Australia should secede and rely on China and the United States for military defence in order to remain an independent nation, free from foreign influence. In 2021, the Small Business Party became the Exit Party, with the aim of improving the lot of Western Australians by achieving autonomy and independence through secession. China becomes Western Australia's largest trading partner. Western Australia accounts for more than half of Australia's total goods trade with China in 2021 to 22, worth $143.6 billion. In the mining sector, China's state-owned iron and steel company, China Baigers Steel Group, or BAO, in September 2022, announced plans to partner with Australia's Rio Tinto to develop the Western Range iron ore project in Western Australia. With all its natural resource wealth and economic revenues, it's making Western Australia feel it would be more prosperous if Australia were an independent nation.